Somebody's actually excited to be somewhere when they take a red eye 5 months pregnant to be there. So I'm super excited to talk to all of you and to Matt and the FirstMark community with Data Driven. Greylock is a 50-plus-year-old venture firm. We have less than 10 investors, an entire team of less than 40, actually based entirely in the Bay Area, but my companies range from SoCal to Dublin to Paris. So we do invest globally in the best companies that we can find. We have a $1 billion fund, and we largely invest in early stage companies and then put more and more capital into them over time as they progress. And our team basically does internet software for businesses and for consumers.
Yeah, and for context, Greylock invested in Facebook and LinkedIn and Dropbox. You're being very humble, but it's like one of the most storied venture capital firm of the Valley. Although you guys were in Boston originally, right?
So the firm was started in Boston, and I'd say we're on our third or fourth reinvention. The most current generation of Greylock was a bunch of partners that got recruited on the West Coast and said, like, software in Silicon Valley is where it's at. And so we were lucky enough to be working with some great companies like Facebook, Instagram, Workday, LinkedIn, Palo Alto Networks, both B2B software and consumer software. And I think, we're just continuing to evolve, and a big part of that is also being part of other ecosystems again.
Yeah, and you invested in, I was just looking at, a number of companies that actually spoke at this event. I mean, Cloudera, of course, Sumo Logic, Trifecta, and Instabase. We had Instabase.
A bunch of our data companies, that's great.
That's terrific. So to this point about investing in other ecosystems, is that a newer thing? I mean, you basically, that investment that you talk about between France and San Francisco, that's this company Screen. That's pretty much the first investment that you guys did in France or Europe? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I have a company that is partly in Paris today, a company that's partly in Dublin that's still in stealth, and a company that's in SoCal. So half my personal portfolio is not in the Bay Area entirely, or I'd say the entire firm reacts to, like, where is the talent? Mm-hmm. Right? I think, traditionally it's been often repeated in venture, and I think true that especially like scale go-to-market talent is most accessible on both the consumer and the B2B side in Silicon Valley. But it only takes a generation or two of great companies for that talent to go everywhere. And great engineers and designers and product people are increasingly everywhere. So we see it manifest in, we look at companies and we get referred companies from all different ecosystems and invest in the stuff we're most excited about. And increasingly that is in other ecosystems as well as in Silicon Valley. And we see people build teams that look different, right? So they build engineering hubs, they build distributed teams, and that has dramatically changed in, call it, the last 3 years.
So the world is changing and you're changing. What about New York?
So I think New York has always been like a up and comer. I think we have a good friend of the firm, Josh Silverman, who's now the CEO of Etsy, which is a great success story for the ecosystem. I think Datadog will be another amazing success story for the ecosystem. I think you have a bunch of like growing Saas players here as well. But I think it only takes a few companies of massive scale to encourage people to be more entrepreneurial as well. Because I don't think it was ever a lack of, core engineering or design talent that really, kept New York in second or third place, right? It was more like access to capital and people choosing to work in young tech companies versus the many other options they have in New York.
And we'll get into like very specific areas that you focus on personally in a second. But what's your overall sentiment, I guess, at Greylock, in the Valley, in the in the ecosystem? We own sort of like year 10 of that crazy bull market, and this big IPO, Zoom, and now Datadog here. Like, is everybody sort of pumped up? Is everybody scared? What's the sentiment?
So how long have you been in venture?
I've been at FirstMark for 6 years.
Okay, so I've been at Greylock for 6.5 years. I was at Goldman for a year before, so basically compatriots in this. And I'm very cognizant. My parents are tech entrepreneurs. We like lived through one tech bubble. I'm very cognizant of having only really operated as a business person in technology in a bull market, right? It's just been going. And I think like we think a lot at Greylock about what is secular. Like we're technology optimists. I think that I just gave a presentation at our LP meeting about a Cambrian explosion of Saas, right? And that suggests like we're gonna have many more species and category of company than used to exist. And so it's not like there were these 4 ERP type companies 10 years ago and we're just gonna move those to the cloud and we're done. I think we're just gonna see a lot of market cap creation. So I fundamentally think we're like in the early innings of that. I think that being said, a different part of our LP presentation looked at multiples at different stages of the life cycle of investing in technology, right? Versus, so this would be how pricey is a seed stage, a Series A, a Series C, a Series F versus 5 or 10 years ago. And one might guess the answer to this question in this audience, but like everything is a multiple more expensive than it used to be. But at the mid stage and at the growth stage, when you begin to see more and more data about how a company is doing, and these models are better and better understood, that multiple has skyrocketed because people see the strength of companies, the opportunity of companies like Zoom, and they see, you know, trillion-dollar market cap businesses in technology. So our reaction to that has been, you know, I think some of that strength is very real. And then as a business, we all think about our comparative advantage. Greylock has traditionally been very strong, and I think willingness is a huge part of it, but willing to take risk on entrepreneurs like pre-product market fit, very early in product market fit. And unlike many of our you know, colleagues in the venture ecosystem, we have not raised an extra $10 billion and like spread it into different funds. We have one fund. We can choose at different stages what we want to invest in. And so our reaction has been largely, okay, well, it seems like comparatively hot later in the ecosystem, later in the life stage of these different companies. If we think we're good at working with entrepreneurs really early, we're going to do that for a while. But I don't think, like the tone of that is not, we don't believe in the opportunity, we do. And so I think you'll also see like general investment pacing increase from us. But I'm a little nervous, you know, 6.5 years in, 7.5 years in, like it cannot go on forever.
And to the point about the explosion of SaaS, I think I read or saw on Twitter somewhere that one of the trends you're excited about is the evolution from SaaS for the enterprise to SaaS for SMB. Is that correct? And if so, what drives that trend?
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely a part of it. I think about the 4 Ws for SaaS companies. One of them is just width of the market in terms of like the type of customers they serve. SMB to like large enterprise, and I think you can have Shopify is an extraordinary example of this, but you can have companies that enable entirely new customer bases to do new things, and they've figured out like web distribution basically to make a different price point work for different customers. But I think there's another kind of width, which is like how much. If we're talking about business software, how many of the users in that business really interact with that software? And so, like, I would posit that there was a generation of software company where you had very large company IT build you something on Oracle or customize SAP, and like when they did that, even after that engineering and IT work had been done, a small set of administrators really interacted with the end product of software. And I think like now when we think about width, like you have much more user adopted software. You have even top-down purchase software where, you know, it really needs broad adoption to be successful, to deliver user value and business value. And so I think one of the things that I personally, and I want Greylock to be world-class at, is figuring out like, okay, well, how do how do we drive user and departmental and team level adoption of software? And then how do we capture value from that because this is not like solved science, right? The first companies that began to do this did it less than 5 or 10 years ago. And I think people are still very much figuring out, it's a business problem of how do you navigate purchasing processes, and a very human problem of like, okay, well, if you sell something and really HR and finance are involved and it affects the entire employee population, who's buying it and how do you get it to actually succeed in a company?
Well, one of the areas that you spend a fair amount of time is security. And it's really interesting, right? So security, not that long ago, wasn't such a hot and exciting area. I mean,
I feel vindicated.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, there were maybe like 2 or 3 famous VC investors who like did their entire career in security and did extraordinarily well at it. But like for the most part, like people were asking, okay, or where are the exits? How big can those companies get? And it was like all on-prem. And so why is that? What are the driving factors? Why it became so interesting now?
Yeah, I think we at Greylock we try really to like make sure that there's a shared tribal knowledge and macro framework for why things are happening. And for me, security is like relatively simple. Like let's say in 2019, you can call it a 75 or $80 billion industry, half of which is software and half of which is services. This is an industry that is still growing like on a multiples basis. And like, I think the reason is just like, it's attached to the growth of the internet, right? Like, why does commerce grow? Why does software grow? I would say most software that is valuable today has to be attached to the internet. The internet's not a safe place. If you think that you have increasingly transactions, systems, customer data that is richer and richer and more important, that's in an unsafe environment, like the sort of defensive industry around protection of it has to similarly grow. And I think the other interesting thing for us to think about is, like, I think the software piece of that is going to grow faster than the services piece. Both will continue to grow, but the United States, at the federal level, and I think governments worldwide, they talk about how this is an important front for warfare in the 21st century, that there's not enough cyber talent. I think any large company would say the same thing. And technologists have been traditionally quite good at filling a labor gap or an expertise gap with tools. So I'm really excited about that. But it's been, I won't say that I so strongly understood this as an investor 6 years ago starting at Greylock. Like, I knew something about networking and was related enough to security that I could go spend a bunch of time in the community and learn it just because I liked it. But I think people from both consumer side, especially a technology-aware audience like this one, they've become much more just cognizant of also what it means from a privacy perspective. So I think there's like protection from IP and transactions and just running your business from an availability perspective, but there are also increasingly high expectations from consumers and from business customers as to how you handle that data. And so I think there are a whole bunch of drivers, but it's like the largest secular one should be there's more on the internet.
And is it fair to say that the shift to the cloud and multi-cloud environments changes a lot of things and opens up a lot of opportunities as well? I mean, is that? Do you think of the whole perimeter versus zero trust type evolution? Is that one of the?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting questions in security is the broad one you bring up, which is like. Most of the, call it $35 or $40 billion of security spend today, it really is still like on-premise tooling in a few known categories, the largest of which happen to be like network and endpoint and some areas like that. And I think like the question Matt's asking is like, we're gonna need to re-architect it, right? And I don't think that the existing spend goes away, but like if you think about the things that people try to do on premise in an environment which requires many fewer access points where you actually can have a better sense of control, like that will not apply if you do not own your infrastructure and you need to interact with many third parties on the internet. So I think this is like the biggest, most obvious opportunity in security, which is like, how do we deal with the fact that we have employees and partners and customers that reach us on the web constantly? And I think, there's been a lot of interest in the idea of zero trust architectures and designing for like a better security world than what we have currently, and actually making cloud and the web a strength. I think very few companies are actually there, and a lot of it is it's not clear what architecture is going to work.
Mm-hmm. And in your portfolio, there's at least 2 companies that are at the intersection between cybersecurity and machine learning.
Yeah.
Is that in the world of security? Does machine learning also have a tremendous impact?
I think Matt can probably summarize our like investing thesis around security very simply in like 2 things. It's basically like hybrid cloud and AI, right? And I think so. We have several companies. We have one company around identity security called Obsidian, which is all around using machine learning to understand user activity patterns. We have a company called Awake Security, which is using machine learning to inspect network traffic, either in your existing on-premise environment or in the cloud. And then we have another company in Stealth that is also using machine learning and security. And I think it's just been really interesting to see, like, I think of security as a data problem, right? I think of it as like basically like you can either re-architect something or you can constantly inspect mass amounts of data to understand what is actually happening in your environment. And I don't think this is a very controversial point of view, but the question is just like, how do we fit modern advancements in machine learning into use cases that immediately deliver business value for security customers? And I think it's been really, really cool. Like Obsidian, for example, how many people have here sort of heard of, thought about explainability as an issue in AI? It's like half the group. That's pretty good. So I think there's a lot of interest in this area. But I think the use cases that people picture for explainability have been relatively limited, right? So there'll be like bias in credit risk underwriting, for example, as like one thing that we need to make sure we can explain and then protect against. But I think security is actually like a sort of forefront industry for machine learning in some ways, because you have a massive amount of different types of data where you have too much data to go inspect manually, and you want to be able to infer a bunch of different behaviors, but the noise level in general in security is such that like you need to be able to explain yourself if you're going to try to deal with it algorithmically. And so Obsidian, as one company around identity analytics, has been like pushed by customers to put that really into the product. I just think it's cool that it's one of the places where we're seeing some of the most interesting advancements in using machine learning in business software.
And beyond security, to your point, AI and machine learning, there's been the ups and downs of the hype cycle. Is that something that you guys think actively as, okay, we need to make more investment in this area, or is a sentiment that, hey, the machine learning is going to be in everything, so it doesn't really matter? Or even like that's, we beyond the window during which we should make investments?
I think 5 of the 6 companies that I am involved with actively today would say like machine learning is a core tenet of like what makes their product work. I think for every company, if you have a secret, if you have a P1 thesis, it's not like the answer for every company, but it's one of a couple. And if it's not, we ask why. So we don't think of it as like machine learning tooling, like bending the curve so more companies can do machine learning with less cost and less expertise, like that's an industry. That's like developer tooling, right? But broadly, like AI is not one industry to us, and we just think about how it will change different types of software. I think one way we frame it is like, why does Greylock think there's going to be a Cambrian explosion? There isn't a Cambrian explosion of software. All of the value that's being created has to come from somewhere. It could come from enabling new activity, like Shopify, it's more commerce. It could come from efficiency, so just like better workflows. Some of it comes from automation, right? So I think like if you can't magically create market cap without explaining where that business value comes from, I think a lot of the business value is going to come from traditionally very like manual labor heavy service industries. So an example would be like running payroll. Like a lot of HR administration has turned into SaaS market cap over the last decade or so. And so I think we're going to continue to see that. I think separately from how it fits into our SaaS thesis, any of the companies on the consumer side that compete on customer experience, like sort of have this deeply embedded understanding that personalization does win, and we all want great experiences, which is exactly the media or whatever it is delivered at exactly the right time. So that's sort of a core part of the thesis there. I think we're seeing more and more companies that are transactional, right? So like I'd argue Uber is an ML company because they use it for demand management and pricing and everything else. And we have Airbnb, which is trying to also match people to great experiences through recommendations. Then I think like there's how it fits into our SaaS thesis. There's what we think of as like core drivers on the consumer side around personalized experiences, and then there's just like AI native, right? So we have a number of autonomy companies, like the capabilities where you just couldn't imagine a couple self-driving car companies in the portfolio if that wasn't a technical possibility.
Great. I have a few more questions, but I'll give this one in the audience now. We could get started. All right.
This way? Yeah, right. I see you're working a lot on AI security, which is an emerging field. And do you have any companies that work on GANs and adversarial networks? Because a smiley face now can cripple a self-driving car if you put it on a sign. So companies like Uber really need to get into that if they want to go to the next phase of what they want to do, which is self-driving cars.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there are companies in the portfolio that think very carefully about what it will mean to have adversaries for their models, right? So more broadly than any specific model architecture, like if you are a self-driving company, one of the sets of edge cases you think about is people who are actively manipulating you. And then in security has always been a defender-adversary game, and so I think anybody who's built security technology before has also probably experienced like what happens when people understand how that technology works. And so I don't want to get into necessarily the technical details of it, but I'd say like people are trying to design for robustness against active adversaries.
Hi, thank you for interesting presentation. So given these mildly amusing geopolitical events these days, where are you seeing the greatest growth in your investment in your portfolio in terms of countries? If not comfortable disclosing that, what about continents?
So we actually take a very simple take on this, which is like we have less than 10 GPs. There are ecosystems where we're going to be obviously the first call, and ecosystems where we just want to be partners to great companies if we are opportunistic. I think by scale and by continued growth, the US continues to overrepresent. And then if you were going to choose two strategically, it would be China and then India, right? So I don't think there's necessarily new news there. I do think it's like we talk pretty regularly about the scale and the difference of this system, like the ecosystem of the internet in China. I think one interesting question we've continued to ask is like, B2B software has not actually been very profitable a industry in China so far. I think you're seeing sort of initial steps toward that in terms of people selling more systems and people investing in homegrown engineering teams for internal tools. And so I'm hopeful that that will continue to grow there. But it's like we actually don't attempt to compete everywhere, but that's where we would go.
Hey, thank you. Could you talk a little bit about pricing strategy and security? Indeed, in the case where your security companies are super successful, their clients never, reach any breach or anything like that, and so seemingly the security, investment provided no value, but truly it did because it blocked, potentially blocked, potential adversaries. How do you think about pricing in this way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's like a couple different known approaches to pricing and security, some of which I believe in more than others. There's like the sort of chase breaches approach, which is just any company who has had the unfortunate, recent experience of knowing that they had a data breach is going to be more willing to spend money, and that's less of a value-based sale versus a reactionary one. I think what we try to do with our companies is more and more the security community is like, they're data driven, right? They want to understand what their risk level is. And so giving people an understanding of like, what does your company's footprint look like from the outside? What are metrics you can actually track in terms of activity of your security team, attacks on you, what has my security product actually done for you? And then also from an efficiency perspective, there are operations in security that people are going to have on an ongoing basis, like that, they will continue to maintain whether or not they have a bad breach that year. So I was an investor in a company called Demisto that was acquired earlier this year, and it's a workflow automation tool, actually. So they never sold to a customer saying like, we're going to prevent XYZ breach from you. They sold on the basis of like, you have a security team, they're doing this work, let us automate this work for you and help you do it more efficiently. So your team can go decide how to spend their time in more high value ways. And I think our experience has been, especially for medium and large companies that are more sophisticated in security, nobody's like necessarily trying to bring their overall security budget down or cut headcount. They're just trying to figure out like, am I doing things that are impactful? I want data back on that. It may not, I actually would prefer as a customer it not be like, I got breached 3 times this week, right? It's like, how do I understand my risk and how do I understand my operation?
Good. All right, one last sort of quick one.
Great. Sorry, I'm hiding behind the videographer here. My question is about the extent to which you think or don't think that GDPR and CCPA and some of the other regulations that are coming around how data is collected and stored and shared with consumers are going to impact your thesis or any of the companies you've invested in.
I think it's a driver of it, right? So if somebody says they make it easier for companies to deal with GDPR and CCPA and be compliant and understand what data they have, like, I'm listening. I think we would actually welcome more of that in the portfolio. Our companies at Greylock at scale, they think about how to architect for this, and then depending on how large they are already, like, just go understand their data. So it's certainly an ongoing problem, and like, if you're I'm not in the business of predicting regulation, but I feel pretty strongly like we're going to move in one direction here, and companies are going to be asked to know much more about their data and have better controls and architect it differently, including in terms of data residency, which people are just not prepared to do.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much. This was terrific. Thank you.